Hello everyone and welcome to this episode, the Allyship One of the Women Talking About Learning podcast. I'm Andrew Jacobs. I want to let people know that before we recorded, I had a real dislike for the term allyship. It has always, to me at least, felt a bit performative. In this episode, we dive into the heart of allyship and what it truly means, how it impacts both personally and professionally, and the subtle yet powerful acts that define it. We have three brilliant guests who delve into the topic. Our first guest is Chloe Duncan. Chloe is an in-house DEI strategist specialising in inclusion-led culture transformation, aligning people's strategy with organisational performance and regulatory obligations. She has designed and delivered inclusion initiatives across charity, emergency services and regulatory sectors, leading organisations to embed sustainable, meaningful change. Our second guest is Fran Harrison. After more than 30 years in learning delivery, design and technologies, Fran has recently changed sides. She's just embarked upon some serious learning of her own in transformative coaching and applied positive psychology, after which she plans to shift towards a more developmental, transformational focus in her practice. Our third and final guest is Nzinga Orgill. Nzinga is the award-winning founder and CEO of a consultancy transforming how organisations communicate, include and serve diverse audiences across events, tourism, aviation and customer experience. With nearly 2 decades of expertise in project delivery, cultural competence and psychological safety, she helps teams move beyond performative gestures and redesign systems so every attendee, customer and colleague feels safe, seen and satisfied. Recorded in early March 2026, this is Women Talking About Learning. This is Chloe, Fran and Nzinga talking about allyship.
Hi everyone, great to have you here with us for this conversation. Fran, I'll come to you first. What brought you to this topic today?
Thanks, Chloe. It's something I've been doing unconsciously for years, is finding the person that's missing in the room, finding the person that's not getting their voice heard, seeing where somebody's not being treated fairly and just standing up for them. I've always stood up for the person that's not able to do so for themselves or just needs an extra hand. And it's something I've been focusing on a bit more in recent years, really. I'm sort of looking to change directions a bit in my career into something that actually actively supports people to self-advocate as well. So, it's something that I'm very passionate about. And Nzinga, what about you?
A lot of what you said, Fran, resonates with me. For myself, it's a little bit selfishly because I've been personally impacted by allyship and how beneficial it has been for me, not just professionally, but also personally. And I really believe if we are talking about anything relating to that, it requires everyone to get involved. So it's understanding and thinking about ways in which we can be of service to each other, acknowledging the fact that we're not all starting from the same place and actually we can do things aligned to who we are to create that more equitable, inclusive space for others to occupy. So yeah, that's probably my reason. What about you, Chloe?
Yeah, thank you. I loved what you said there about the personal impact, because I think that's why this is such a rich topic, is in some way we'll all have experience of either being an ally or being shown allyship. And that's what makes it such an interesting thing to discuss. And for me as well, I think it's a really fascinating concept because we talk about allyship a lot, especially in the context of things like coming into International Women's Day and Pride Month, for example. But it's not always something that we have space to explore on a deeper level. And I find in the workplace, we're often asking people to be allies without really actually giving them the kind of support and guidance they might need to do that. So I think it's a topic really worth talking about and kind of diving more deeply into. And I suppose with that, I wondered what you both thought about how we actually define allyship and what it actually is. Should we start there?
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, I've sort of started talking about it a bit before, but to me, it's having your eye across the room and firstly spotting who's virtual or otherwise and spotting who's not there in the first place and should be. And also people, I started a background in school teaching. So you're constantly, you've got your eyes across 30, 35 people. And some of them aren't speaking, some of them aren't contributing. It's unpicking why. It's also very much not assuming you know why. It's asking questions. There's a lot of more asking questions than actually trying to guess answers for me. So I think it's making sure you understand, and everybody's different. There's no two people that need the same kind of allyship, and no two circumstances. So I think it's making sure that you understand how somebody wants to be supported and what's best for them. Nzinga, what do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore, Fran. I think really being clear about how you're being an ally to someone is so important, because actually it's not just about your intentions, it's about the impact it has on the individual you're offering that opportunity to. When I think about allyship, Chloe, I think about things like psychological safety. I think about
Mm.
power imbalances and how we can support individuals who might be potentially coming from positions that aren't necessarily in power. I know there's often the conversation around privilege that's linked quite closely to allyship as well, and maybe some opportunities there to change or reframe the narrative around privilege being seen as a bad thing, but actually something that could be used positively to support allyship further. I think about advocating for voices that are not being heard and experiences that are not being factored into decision making. So there's lots of different things that allyship talks about, and I think lots of different ways people can show up as an ally. And for me, it's just, and I think you touched upon it, Fran, it's really, really important to think about when you are presenting yourself as an ally, those you're being an ally to want you as an ally. I've
Yeah.
had it before where people have stepped in to intervene and support me on something I hadn't communicated. And actually, I felt quite vulnerable and exposed, and almost as though I didn't have the power to decide what I needed support or what I needed advocacy on. So I think it's really important that there is some intentionality and clarity around where you are being an ally, and the fact that it can show up very, very differently depending on the nature of the situation, the environment, but also the people that you're dealing with.
Yeah,
100%.
absolutely agree. I think more and more as I've thought about allyship, particularly in the workplace, but more broadly too, that idea really resonates with me of co-creation. I think traditionally when we talk about allyship, people think of it as quite binary in terms of the power. It's very fixed and rigid. There's an ally and they have this power and they're going to share it with the beneficiary and that's going to solve some sort of situation. But I quite like thinking about it as more of a partnership in terms of challenging an unfair system or practice. There's a really great Canadian research study which looked at the impact of power in allyship. And I think what both of you have said there about the beneficiary needing to be someone who can also define what allyship is needed. Sometimes I think that's the first step in an organisation, to think about what allyship is actually needed here, not just what that individual or that group can maybe bring.
You just made me think a little bit. There are certain parallels with servant leadership where you don't automatically assume you know what the answer is. You have to stand back and say, ask people what do we need? Because we don't have all the answers. And the first step in is recognizing that you don't have all the answers for it. And it's also,
Yeah.
it's not the thing that I always think about it. You see people that step in, do the allyship thing, and it's kind of a platform for them. It's not about them. It's about the person. You should be able to provide whatever support's needed, but then step back. And actually, I think as an ally myself, when I'm trying to be that for somebody, if nobody knows I've done it, I've won. I've succeeded because I'm visible. To the person, when the person's in the space they need to be, I should be invisible. I might need to shout loudly to get that person the visibility they need, but then I vanish, and that should be kind of how it is. It's quite simplified, but yeah, it's that sort of idea of it's not about me. It's about the people or the group or the person that needs that extra help to be heard.
I couldn't agree more. It's about centering the individual who you're supporting, which is so important. And often that can get lost in translation. I think what you touched upon in terms of, broadcasting that you're an ally. I have a lot of trouble with people who are constantly, claiming I'm an ally and I do all of this and I do all of that, because I can appreciate that whilst they might very well be, it doesn't feel as though it's being done for the right reasons or centered around the right person. So I think that's a really, really important piece when we think about allyship. And also just the fact that, there's so many other terms that are being bounced around that are quite similar, that aren't quite the same. So, mentoring and sponsorship. I know sponsorship is a form of allyship, but mentoring and coaching, which are equally as important, but aren't actually allyship because they don't do the same types of things. And I think it's really important when people are having conversations around allyship, they're educated about what it means, because if you don't fully know what it means, you don't really know how you're going to be able to support support individuals and the people that you're serving. And then I think the final thing for me that really, really kind of, sticks in my mind when I think about, allyship is the fact that, we really have to consider, and this is based on someone who has been an ally and who has, and I've just spoken about not talking about being an ally, but I know that I have, but also who has received support from an ally. It's a mutual exchange. It often feels as though, as an ally, I'm here to support you and serve you, and I'm here to, lift you into spaces and to share opportunities with you, which are all those things. But actually, with my allyship partnership with the person who was an ally for me, I was equally an ally for that person as well, because there were experiences and opportunities that I was able to share with that person. So I think, again, it's really important to think about the language that we use with it, so it doesn't often feel that people who are on the receiving end of having an ally are those that need support and have nothing to offer apart from the willingness to want to be helped, because that will also impact on, I guess, how people show up in that dynamic.
Yeah, and Nzinga, I love what you've said there about the kind of the two-way nature of allyship, because I think, as Fran was saying, quite often allyship is seen as something that's really loud or really visible, but actually a lot of it can be more about the learning and the listening. And I think particularly when we're talking about allyship rather than on an individual basis, but more for a group or trying to help a particular population in an organization, actually that listening is often a really key first stage to understand what kind of allyship is needed, rather than just trying to, for example, turn up to a particular event and show support. It's those small, consistent actions that happen over time. And I'd be really interested from you both, actually, is there any kind of standout examples of where really positive or impactful allyship you've seen an example that you've experienced personally or one you've witnessed in an organisation that actually hasn't been really loud and visible, but has been more those quiet, consistent acts of allyship? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I mean, I think I've seen leaders in the organisation I previously worked in. There's one particularly that comes to mind, and he was incredibly good at that whole thing of spotting who wasn't in the meeting, who was missing, who was getting all the voice, and then messaging in the background maybe and saying, did you have any input on that? But just being there very silently, and very senior person, but very aware of everybody in the organisation at all levels and making sure everybody had a voice. And I think that it summarised for me. It was nearly always invisible, but it was just not making a loud thing about it in a meeting or in a situation, just quietly messaging in the background or having a chat and seeing if there's anything that somebody needed. And never getting credit for it, but always being there for people.
Yeah, I really like that example, because it's about breaking this big concept of allyship down into those small everyday acts that we can all take to support one another in different ways. It almost demystifies it a bit, I think.
Yeah. When I think back to my experience, it's quite an interesting and funny one, only because it was a particular senior leader. And it was actually on the back of a very difficult conversation. So my background is aviation and construction. So as you can imagine, it's very male dominated. And at times it could feel very much like, any allyship I could get would be muchly appreciated or greatly appreciated. But having had quite a challenging conversation with a particular senior leader and getting that individual to see my perspective and then decide to commit to being an ally, in terms of giving me opportunities or sharing what I do in spaces that I don't occupy, it really allowed me to see a couple of things. First of all, the responsibility for myself to own and decide what I want in terms of allyship and support. It's not for other people to say, Nzinga, you look like you need this and this and this, so therefore we're going to give you that. Actually, I'm the driving force behind the type of allyship that I need. Secondly, just that allyship can change depending on the space and the position you are at in terms of, whether you've moved roles within an organization, whether you are operating in a slightly different space with a slightly different audience. And it kind of brings in the conversations around different types of allyship. We spoke about advocacy, but you've also got, scholars, you've also got people who are confidants. And I know in my professional career, the confidant allyship has really supported me, because sometimes you just do need a psychological safe space where you can speak. So I think, seeing it done well is where someone has kind of said, what do you need from this? What can I do to serve you and best support you? And what does it look like as we move through different spaces and landscapes? What about yourself, Chloe? Have you had any
Yeah.
experiences of it done well?
I really liked what you said there about I can define the kind of allyship that I need, because I think early in my career, I saw allies and allyship as this concept of allies just exist. They're there or they're not, and it's about identifying them. But as I've gone through my career, I think similarly, I've become really a lot more open to finding the unexpected allies. And I find that strong advocates can often come from a place you might not predict. It's just that they're waiting to find a way to help, particularly time-poor senior leaders. So I think one example that stands out to me is I was working in a very male-dominated context. It was a very operationally driven emergency services context. So it wasn't always the main topic of conversation. We weren't always having time or space to think about inclusion. And I ended up having a conversation with a senior leader just following a training session they had been on, where I spotted almost a spark of interest in them, that they were really finding different experiences through this training session, listening to different colleagues. And it started to dawn on them really that actually maybe some people found this environment a bit more challenging than they did. They were part of the majority group. They had always seen themselves reflected in these rooms. And it dawned on them at that point that there were different experiences in the organisation, but they had no idea what to do to help. And so using that hook and that kind of pocket of allyship potential in that moment, we were able to really access a lot of perspective taking through the rest of our conversation and help them to translate that empathy then into a workplace action. And we worked together to host listening circles so they could understand more about different colleague experiences. And I think through that experience, I was really able to understand that actually a lot of leaders in organizations in particular, but many people at all levels, are very willing allies. They just might need that push or that bit of extra assistance or time and space to actually think about it. So yeah, I think defining the kind of allyship that we need in an organization and providing the support for individuals to take that forward is really crucial when we're thinking about this and how important it can be in a workplace.
I think something that I wonder about sometimes is how to work with somebody who's been in a situation where they've been underrepresented for so long they don't even recognize it, and how to support that person to see that they might have the opportunity to progress in a way they possibly didn't realize, or to realize that they're not getting the airspace they should be, and how to achieve that, because you don't want to impose, obviously, because we've discussed that before, how you can support that person to sort of step forward and realize their potential and the opportunities they have, and to investigate it safely, because you don't want to put them in a sort of a terrifying space where they're suddenly exposed. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question, Fran. And what I would be inclined to lean towards is there's a piece around awareness of allyship and being clear about what it means and how to access it and how to, I guess, take advantage of it as much as possible. And where I see there is an opportunity is that often it isn't being spoken about in the places and spaces that it needs to be. So it's almost like you need advocacy for allyship, because there are rooms where it's not being mentioned, there are rooms where it's not being spoken about, and rooms where it's not being considered. And yeah, I think just very similar to kind of what I've mentioned before, it is about driving the direction of where you want to go and what you need the allyship support for. But ultimately, you don't really know what's available unless you know that it's out there. So taking the opportunity and the advantage to really, build it into conversations. As a leader, I always talk about the fact that I'm passionate and I'm massive, in terms of my belief in the benefit of allyship. So it already kind of signposts to people towards myself. And, there's other ways to demonstrate that allyship without it actually having to be a case of you saying it or having a label, to indicate that you're someone who promotes and supports allyship. It can be in the inclusive language that you use. It can be in the type of conversations that you enter into and share. So I think, there's a lot of opportunities there, but that's definitely a starting point.
I really like that, Nzinga, what you were mentioning there in terms of the signposting element and just making people aware. It's almost a case of build it and they will come in some senses. I think I've had a lot of conversations with leaders about providing spaces for allyship at an organizational level as well as an individual level. And oftentimes they say, well, I hosted that listening circle and only 5 people came, or I put that post out on our intranet and only 1 person responded. And I think, Fran, with your question there about how do we get someone to realize they could benefit from allyship, quite often it can be a case of building that space and hosting it repeatedly, whether that is a listening circle or it's a one-to-one coffee conversation. I think there's a space for it to grow organically there, where that person will be able to define for themselves, as you say, what that allyship might look like, what they're interested in, what they might need. But it's about creating those spaces consistently enough. And Nzinga, as you said, signposting consistently so that it becomes a way of thinking and a way of working in an organisation, as much as it is something that relates to particular awareness dates or different events too.
Yes, I like that idea of sort of build it and they will come, isn't it? Yes, and I work with the RSA quite a bit at the moment, and we're creating sort of new events where people can collaborate. It's not necessarily allyship, though it rapidly becomes it when you start seeing the conversations, creating these opportunities for people to meet and network and collaborate. And yes, the first few times people sort of watch, particularly people who might feel threatened by that will watch to see how it goes and see if it's safe before they step in. And I think it's so important to just maintain that and be consistent and keep going. It's not I think back to women's, we're recording this, but just before International Women's Day, I think to that, and there's so much performative allyship where somebody has to do something loud and broadcast it all over, and literally the following day, nothing's happening. And you think, well, that wasn't about the people that need allyship, that was about you, wasn't it? And it's so important. I would love to have a rule where if you're going to post about International Women's Day, you have to say what you did in the last year, what you're going to do next year, and what impact it had. Just ban everything else. And then you really start seeing people that have to stand by their word and act it.
I completely agree. I think there is a real issue with allyship sometimes that it can be so performative because it is naturally linked to International Women's Day or Pride Month. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about it as a concept, and Nzinga, I think you mentioned it earlier, is that actually there's a lot that underpins it, which just goes into skills that need to be built to be a good ally. And I think you mentioned earlier psychological safety, the ability to create those spaces where people do feel they can be themselves, they can talk openly, to really create that authentic allyship. And I think there's elements to including empathy and active listening, which sometimes people consider allyship to be something that really needs to be loud and visible, as we've said. And actually, they're missing some of those soft skills and those everyday actions, which contribute much more than a LinkedIn post would once a year.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about allyship and the people it's serving, it's there to serve everybody because we all benefit from allyship, and having allies in the right places and spaces. It does do a lot to also support those who might be underrepresented, where there are natural inequities, which means they're not able to get certain opportunities or to advance their careers or, their ways of working in a way that aligns to who they are. But, one of the things that I believe is really, really important when we are talking about allyship, and just, I guess, to kind of go back a little bit to Fran's question, yes, it isn't about just building it. It's also about being able to talk about it. It's about being able to share people that have gone through it. There's a credibility piece around the fact that, we're talking about something that's meant to be offering benefits and values to people, but we're not able to showcase what that looks like for an actual individual. We're not able to say, well, that person has experienced allyship and it's meant this for that individual professionally and personally. And when we're able to kind of show those things, it's really important to kind of tie in that social proving and credibility. On the performative piece, as someone who's been in the inclusion space for, well over a decade now, International Women's Day is a love or hate for me for many reasons. The first being, I absolutely love to celebrate, anything around being a woman, the woman's lived experiences, what we encounter. And I think it's a celebration or something that should be acknowledged by everybody, irrespective of if you're a woman or a man. But it's really important that we are centering all those experiences that come from women, and that some are not being excluded and left out, because it doesn't just feel performative. It's actually quite dangerous if we're doing events where we're not representing the intersectionality of women, and we're not bringing people together. We can't even start to think about having conversations around allyships, because right there and then is the opportunity to be an ally, to maybe look around at some of the events and spaces and say there are certain types of women that are missing from these spaces. As somebody who is acting in my capacity as an ally, I'm going to advocate for those absent voices that absolutely need to be here. So again, it's not just about doing these things and almost ticking the box and saying, yay, we had a great conversation about this and that. It's about understanding and thinking about, well, who is missing from that conversation? How do I make sure that their voices are being brought in? And how do I make sure that going forward, those voices are continuously brought into conversations? So just a consideration when we think about allyship, and I guess how we can make it sustainable, because that's the intention, isn't it? And just, I guess, to the final bit I'll say on this piece is around the fact that it should be woven into everything. Like, I know sometimes we use cultural events or dates in, calendars to raise more awareness around it. But in fact, allyship should be happening throughout the entire year, every single day, all the time, without it needing to feel scheduled, planned, and highlighted. So that's kind of, where I'm thinking around it.
Yeah.
I think it's be an interesting question to ask people who are listening in to us, and hopefully you're sort of finding things that you can take away from it, is to consider when this goes out, what have you done since, say, for example, International Women's Day? What actions have you seen around you since then? What has happened in your workplace? And also, what are the plans going into next year as well? So, did everybody just do something on the day and eat cake, or did everybody actually undertake to see how they can be better allies, and to look for those people that might benefit and are missing and probably have valuable contributions that are being missed?
Yeah, I really like those points, because I think when we're talking about this, when we're talking about allyship as a concept, and we're talking about small everyday actions you can take, actually sometimes it's about the structural elements that are underpinning the experiences of those individuals. So when you are creating spaces for them to share their experiences, or you are celebrating women on International Women's Day, and leaders are talking to, whether it's an ERG or an individual in their team or organization, they're hearing those experiences. Allyship is what happens next. It's not the fact that you hosted that event or the fact that you listened in that conversation. It's what you took from that and used your power or your position to do. So I think there's a real kind of journey of allyship that starts with listening and learning, and then moves on to that action too.
Yeah, agreed. I think there's also a piece around being brave, because with anything that involves people, especially when you're stepping out as leader, whether it's an inclusive leader or through allyship or whatever capacity, there is that fear and concern and worry about getting things wrong. That often means that people do not put themselves forward or don't get fully involved, and who don't want to, necessarily partake in certain things. And I think what's really important is, when we are speaking about allyship or inclusion or both, it's not a fixation on it has to be done the right way or not at all. It has to be perfect. It has to be something that creates psychological safety for those who are on the receiving end, but also those that are partaking as well. Because where there are mistakes, or where things aren't necessarily done in a way that might have been the best choice, there's that opportunity to reflect and refine and think about how we can be better allies, or how we can better support people. I've seen it so many times where I've asked the questions of individuals, amazing leaders, do you do any allyship? And it's like, well, no, because I made the wrong statement once, and I felt so worried about getting it wrong and kind of letting people down. I just thought, we make it so heavy sometimes. And actually, it really isn't about it being heavy. It's important, absolutely, but it's about understanding that we are, fellow human beings working at how we can best support each other, and center and get back down to that. And on the piece around human beings, just when you think about, when I think about allyship, and I think about when I've needed it or when I supported people, there's a bravery around being courageous enough to say that I need support. and I know what that support is, and I know that I haven't got what I need to get me where I need to get to, so I need your support, or I need, you know, your advocacy. And just being able to honor the fact that someone has chosen to put their trust in you for something that could be really important to them, like their professional journeys or their personal experiences. So when we are approaching allyship, it isn't just a formative, tokenistic ticking a box because I'm doing the right thing. It's with a custodian of a part of someone's journey. And in order for them to maybe realize that journey, we really need to think about how we're able to responsibly support them with that. So yeah, just some thoughts around the impact of allyship.
And a thought you've given to me talking about leadership, and here's a bit of allyship for you to add into the call anyway. I feel very strongly that you can be an incredible leader without being a manager. So it's not necessarily hierarchical. You could be at the entry level of an organization. You can be an extraordinary leader just by being there and standing up for what's right, listening, observing, calling things out. And it's a fantastic opportunity. And it's something for people to consider. Is there a way in which I could lead more? And it's a great experience, isn't it? It's a great thing to be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think combining both your points there, kind of bringing the human back into it, and that idea that anyone can be a leader and can be an ally. Just to share an example for me, I saw a really great example of allyship from a colleague who's not a manager or a senior leader in the organization I'm in, where I had shared with them that on my lunch break, I'd experienced a really negative incident, and it was in relation to just overhearing some really damaging homophobic language. And I mentioned this to a colleague and shared my experience. I shared that I felt I needed to step away from the computer. And their allyship showed up in the most simple way of just letting me know that they would take it from there. I didn't have to communicate it again. I didn't have to let anybody else know. They would give apologies to my meeting, and I could go and take the time and space I needed. And it was a small thing in some ways, but it really transformed my experience of being in the workplace that day. And so I think that element of just bringing it back to the human sometimes, that what we're trying to achieve here in the workplace in particular is creating an environment where people are comfortable, they feel like they belong, they're respected for who they are and what they bring. It's not this mysterious concept that you achieve allyship and then something incredible has happened. It's quite simple in many ways.
Oh, Chloe, I couldn't agree with you more. Like, I've seen some really fantastic examples of it recently. So I'm doing quite a lot of work with multi-generational workplaces, and in particular Gen Z and the emerging Gen Alphas, but Gen Z in particular, who'll be moving into the workforce soon. And you'd think because they are the newest members of the workforce, that there'd be an inclination to think that they need to be the ones that receive allyship and are advocated for and are sponsored and provided safe spaces. But actually, because of just the way in which they prioritize inclusion, a lot of them are stepping in as allies already. And I think it's just a wonderful, almost like a evolution in terms of how we're really viewing these things and how we're really prioritizing them in terms of what it means for individuals and for business. And I think it's so important that we do think about how to support each other, and how we center the human experience, especially obviously with the increased use of technology, where there is maybe not as much human connection. When we are connecting, is it intentional? Is it creating the outcomes that we want? Are we able to pick up on the cues and advocate for people and be allies in the moments that we share, or are they potentially being lost and maybe becoming further removed as a human race? So just some thoughts in terms of where my mind is at around allyship and what the future looks like for it.
That's really interesting. And I think in terms of looking at allyship and how much it's needed more and more in the society we're living in, I wonder if we think about where allyship is not so present, where it's really needed, what could people be doing if they're seeing that need for allyship in their organization, their workplace, and they want to encourage it more?
You can set a good, you can demonstrate good allyship to other people. So you can communicate and give people the courage in sharing what you're doing. So very much I always think of it when I'm sort of representing somebody, I stand for them, I then stand with them, and then I stand behind them. And it's that gentle withdrawal and then, support other people to try it themselves. But it's making sure that you're doing it in a safe space for the person, a safe space for the organisation. And it's not about you. It's about making sure that everybody understands your focus should always be on the person you're trying to support.
Yeah, absolutely agree with what you said, Fran. I love the term that you've used around, standing behind and really fully supporting the individual. For myself, it's very much the same. It's about raising awareness so people first of all know what allyship is, what it means, making it really not easy but simple to understand. There's a lot of terms that are being bounced around in the inclusion world, and people often get quite snowed under with what they mean and worry about getting it wrong. So when we can strip back what isn't needed and make it really clear for people, then definitely. What's I think a great way is to showcase where there's been instances of allyship already. People are already being allies. They just might not be aware of that. And if we can really talk to those experiences, there's that build in terms of confidence around, wow, it's actually something that I already know quite well, or something that I'm doing, so I can do more of it and I can talk about it through how I approach allyship. And then just, on the back of awareness, on the back of creating simple processes that will allow people to step in as an ally, really celebrating what comes out the other end. We talk about allyship, but what are we doing it for, and how are we acknowledging and recognizing the wonderful success that we get from having successful, allyship situations and partnerships? What does it mean for people, not just professionally, but also in, personal spaces where allyship is just as beneficial and useful? So there's really a massive piece again around advocating for allyship.
Definitely, really agree with both your points there. And I think what it's reminded me is that there are just so many different ways to be an ally, and those will depend on the individual or the groups or the context that you're working in. But it's about trying consistently small things, everyday behaviors or actions, because they will add up and they will have that ripple effect to creating an inclusive culture or environment where you are. And that's allyship overall.
Yeah, 100%. There's so much we can do, and it's so valuable. It's not an added extra. It's the core of any organisation, because if you're missing voices, you're missing the diversity of opinion and the quality.
Absolutely agree. And I think having conversations like this, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you, Fran, and speak with you, Chloe, and just to kind of talk about something that I hold very dearly to my heart and I'm very passionate about. I've enjoyed sharing space and would encourage people to get out there and talk about allyship, because, you'll get so much from the conversations that you have.
Yeah, thank you ever so much, both of you. It's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Completely agree. Thank you both so much. I think I found 2 new allies today.
I got loads from this conversation. The label ally can weigh heavy, but our guest discussion has really helped clarify what it means to practice allyship. Most importantly, allyship isn't a one-time act, but a continuous commitment to support and uplift those around us. An enormous thank you to Chloe, Fran and Nzinga for their time, and you'll find all their details along with links to the subjects they spoke about in the show notes. We are still looking for guests for upcoming episodes, and if you'd like to find out more, then please email us hello@larn.com. Remember to like and subscribe to the podcast on your podcast player. It does make a real difference in helping people find and recommend us. We're back in a couple of weeks, and next time it's the pregnancy one. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.